Hello everyone, my name is Yassine Shaheed with The Perfect Freight Source. In today's lecture, we're going to be discussing asset carriers versus freight brokers and how each one can add value to your business. That's right, we are going back to the basics. You know, sometimes you just got to get back to the basics, redefine your approach, and just tighten up those loose bolts. Now, this focus will be directly on road transportation, truckload transportation. Transportation managers, sourcing managers, if you are watching this video, please do not shy away from it. Even though you might know all this stuff, this could be a refresher, or you might learn something new to where you be able to apply it to your business. So let's dive right in. Asset carriers versus freight brokers. What they both do? They both provide transportation services, right? One has assets and the other one does not. But when we're talking about assets in the transportation sector of supply chain or just transporting goods, what assets are we talking about? Trucks, trailers, and if you're a shipper that needs to reduce inventory levels and transportation costs, you'll need a provider to provide warehousing. And then there's rail cars for rail transportation, and you got liners and vessels for ocean transportation. So I classify these as the external assets. These are your physical assets. Now, if we have external, then we have internal. So what internal assets could we be possibly talking about? Information technology, that's right. EDI, electronic data interchange. TMS, transportation management systems. Then we have barcoding, and then there's point of sale technology. Now there's one that we always overlook and we never take in consideration. That is experience and expertise. Yes, that is an asset. For example, depending on what state you live in, when you're getting ready to onboard with your employer makes you sign a non-competition agreement. Why? Because if you resign or get terminated, you cannot work with any company that's in direct competition with that employer because you become an asset, right? So these are your internal assets. Now, freight brokers, they have to have transportation management systems. If they don't, I don't see how they're operating their business. If they're a startup, they can be lacking the experience and expertise. Now, these assets don't pay for themselves. So now we're going to get into how these two providers price their services. Now, let me start off. Every shipper is different, okay? Every shipper is different depending on their size and their needs. Smaller shippers deal directly with brokers and intermediaries because they lack the buying power and they have small volumes. Now, large shippers that have the buying power deal strategically with asset carriers and selecting their carriers by analyzing a carrier's geographic coverage and capacity and share large volumes to receive great discounts in transportation costs. This is relatively known as a core carrier program. In addition to discounts, if that shipper controls outbound and inbound flows, that carrier can offer greater discounts because that shipper eliminates the issues for that carrier dealing with deadheading on empty miles, deadheading to another shipper for a backhaul, fuel consumption, and wasted hours. Here's a fun fact for you. In the late 90s, there was a study, and this study showed that the average truck wastes 33.3 hours a week. 33.3 hours. So that's basically a whole day. Now, when a shipper uses this practice, this is called lean logistics, eliminating waste. Now, some of you might be asking, could a freight broker be part of a core carrier program? Yes, most definitely. A freight broker has the flexibility offering the best in-class solutions. Now, a core carrier program would be contractual between the shipper and the carrier, benefiting the shipper to have total control of costs, guarding against fluctuation in rates, keep landed costs of goods low in competitive situation, forcing commitments between the shipper and the carrier, accountability for performance, and penalization for non-compliance. Now, are there risks in a core carrier program? Yes, there's risk in everything. And one of the risks is surveillance. You lose the freedom of shopping of low prices in the market. The second one is you misplace trust in the hands of carriers that cannot fulfill or choose to fulfill their service obligations. And the third is continuity. Over time, that core carrier can become financially weak, right? And operate weak. And you will not have a substitute for that. So those are some of the risks. Now, pricing. When these two get invited for an RFP, the two will use two pricing methods. And the first one is value of service. Now, freight brokers, really contract, spot market, doesn't matter. They always use value of service. Value of service is charging on what the market bears and the demand for transportation services in a competitive situation. Now, asset carriers use value of service as well, but it's in the equation of cost of service or cost to serve a customer distinctively. These rates cover a asset carrier's fixed and variable costs and includes allowance for profits. That's right. Everybody's in business to make money. Now, fixed and variable costs include assets, wages, expenses of activity and inactivity. Okay? Now, if a shipper is using these two providers and they're both competing for freight, a lot of times freight brokers have a cost advantage over asset carriers. Why? Because they don't bear the expenses of an asset carrier, right? So they can have lower pricing on freight lanes. Now, outside of contracts, freight brokers, they have a lot of flexibility. They can keep up with rapid rates of change and they can optimize freight expenses. So that means they can squeeze down on their margins, right? To come down smaller to satisfy that shipper. Now, always, asset carriers, keep in mind, they have what is called asset depreciation, if they are truly asset carriers, which goes into my next discussion. Control capacity or guarantee capacity. Now, this topic is going to open up a can of worms, but it must be discussed for the ones that are not aware. First, freight brokers or non-asset 3PLs, they don't have any assets, right? So they don't have any control or guarantee capacity. Freight brokers get their trucks from trucking boards, or they might have a database full of carriers where they choose from. In a lot of cases, let me add, because we are a freight broker company, I have to support the freight brokers here. So freight brokers build relationships with their subcontractor carriers and create what is called strategic partnerships when business opportunities are identified. Either projects with volume or frequent lanes that occur on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, these brokers go into these discussions with these carriers and discuss these opportunities and negotiate satisfying rates to ensure capacity. Now, this will only be per shipment. The agreement will only be by per shipment or the volume agreed upon the two, but is not obligating that carrier to commit, and they cannot get penalized for not committing. So this is not so-called guaranteed capacity. Now, when we're talking about asset carriers and we're talking about controlled and guaranteed capacity, how I define that is on the asset side, assets that are fully owned, right, under no constraints that can be partially or fully utilized when capacity is needed. Since this focus is directly on truckload transportation, road transportation, let's take a minute and talk about individuals and entities that possess a motor carrying operating authority. Individuals or entities that possess a motor carrying operating authority is considered a transporting carrier, depending on, just really how it is filed and how it's granted by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. So in the eyes of a shipper, it is perceived that that individual or entity is a trucking company that has equipment to transport freight. But this is not always the case. Just because that business has a operating authority does not mean they physically own trucks. That trucking, so-called trucking company could be a owner-operated base company that leases owner-operators that have the assets to transport the freight, right? So this is so-called not guaranteed or controlled in this particular situation. Now, you got trucking companies that physically own trucks. That's obvious. But a lot of trucking companies are starting to implement a owner-operator program within their organization, and this is a growing market. And the reason for this movement is a lot of drivers, youth drivers, that with these bigger trucking companies, they're starting to leave them as soon as they get their experience because they want to be more independent. They want to be more in control. And third, they want to have a sense of pride calling themselves business owners, right? This is a growing market. Now, I don't have any statistical data, so don't shoot me, but from my experience and what I've seen personally, this is happening on a daily basis. So, owner operators, they lease on with trucking companies. They lease on with trucking companies as independent contractors. Now, under their contract, they're not under many obligations and constraints hindering them from running their business. So they can reject loads. They can dispatch themselves, find another dispatcher to book their loads. They can go find business on their own. So they're basically a business inside of a business. And sometimes this can be conflicting at times, right? So some of you are saying, okay, Mr. Shahi, all this sounds good and dandy. So what is your point here? What I'm saying is, if you're a shipper that's using asset carriers or looking for potential asset carriers, you need to do a thorough analysis on that trucking company. A lot of you are not doing it. Some of you are doing it, but a lot of you are not doing it. On your carrier questionnaire, you need to ask questions like, how many trucks do you have? Then what is asset owned and what is owner operated owned? This will give you more insight on that trucking company. Then you'll know what's actually controlled and guaranteed. Now let's do a quick example. Let's just say I got 100 trucks, right? 25% of that are asset owned. 75% is owner operated. Give or take, let's just roll the dice. Since you own some trucks, 50% on your assets, you can bring us 12 and a half trucks. That's 12.5. Give or take on the owner-operated trucks, hey, 1%. We're going to just use the 1% rule. So then that's 7.5. So we got a total of what? 20 trucks? So then you can kind of really, gauge it. You can measure that. So that's some of the things that you should be looking into if you're a shipper. Now, the last thing that I wanted to discuss is the 6 characteristics of transportation services that affect customer service. And we're going to play a little game here. We're going to rate each provider based on risk and capabilities on these characteristics. Now, the first one is dependability, consistency of service. Freight brokers deal with a multitude of carriers, so each shipment can pose a risk. Drop loads, late pickups and deliveries, wrong equipment, inconsistent rates. This is an issue. Freight brokers must evaluate carriers and select carefully when subcontracting. This is checking the carrier SMS percentiles, making sure they have the amount of coverage for a particular load, right? And also checking the attitude of drivers and their response time. That's a big one as well. Making sure they have an active operating authority. Now, on the asset side, it's the same carrier. They know the shipper's business, they know the shipper's products, and they deliver the same rates. This enables peak performance. Also, reoccurring loads. If that same particular driver that's moving those loads, not only do they build a relationship with the shipper staff, but on the customer staff as well. This creates trust and put a shipper in a comfortable zone, right? Now, this outlook is on a perfect world. And we know there's no perfect world, so there's risk. So what risk are we talking about? What if your carrier can't bring in trucks like they say they can bring in trucks? What if your provider is saying that, hey, your rates don't satisfy us, or your problems are not that important? Keep in mind, this could be an issue, but the chances of that happening diminish when using an asset carrier. So we're going to roll with asset carriers. I'm going to give them a point. Now, the second one is time in transit. Time in transit really falls under dependability. So we're going to give asset carriers a point on that as well. The third one is market coverage. Being able to provide door-to-door service. Now, you got certain asset carriers don't run certain lanes, or they only service certain regions, right? And there's also many variables. Changes in the market that affect rates. Capacity. Freight brokers have that mobility to go outsource and find a carrier to provide that kind of service. So I'm going to give freight brokers a point on this section. All right. Now, the fourth one is flexibility. Being able to handle a variety of a shipper's products and meeting the needs of a shipper. You might have a shipper that has bulk loads that go long distance. You might have LTL freight, over-dimensional freight, hazmat. Asset carriers are only limited to what kind of transportation service they can provide. Now, the fifth one is loss and damage performance. Loss and damage performance. Freight handling and knowing the business benefits a shipper when using reoccurring carriers. Asset carriers take full responsibility of liabilities. In addition to this, bigger asset carriers that have the staff and the experience and knowing how to address and resolve freight claims is also a plus, right? Now, freight brokers, even though that they're insured, they meet the insurance requirements of a shipper, all freight claims are passed to subcontractors. So service levels for a broker is very critical. In addition to this, sometimes subcontractors, they feel not liable in certain situations, so they can be very non-compliant. So keep that in mind. I'm going to give asset carriers another point in this section. And the last one is virtual integration. Virtual integration is providing more than just basic transportation, but become part of a shipper's logistics program and marketing program. So I'm going to give freight brokers a plus on this as well. So that wraps it up, guys. Now, before I end this video, here are some of my sources to support this lecture. The first one is The Definitive Guide to Transportation. This is an awesome book. If you're a freight broker who just got into this business, if you don't know nothing about transportation, check this book out. Okay, it's an awesome book. Also, transportation managers, I know it's been so long, this will brush you up right here. So check this book out. The next one is Fundamentals of Logistics Management. I love this book. It's very informative. I actually believe that this is a required textbook for you guys who actually went to school for logistics, supply chain. So this was a required textbook, I believe. It's an awesome book. This encompasses everything about logistics. Okay. And the last one, Essentials of Supply Chain Management. To be honest with you, I don't even think that, I just don't know any information that was said came from this book. But I studied this book a while back ago, so I might have said something. So just to kind of cover, want to make sure all the references are in there. Check this book out, Essentials of Supply Chain Management. Now, transportation managers, if you're looking at this video, please, if you got any questions or concerns, if we need to sit down and talk and help you, give us a call or email us. I know some of you guys are like, hey, you know what? We're fine. We're good. We don't need no help. Hey, we are living in an evolving world. Things can happen every day, right? Look how Amazon became, right? Let's look at Walmart. Take a look at what happened to Toys R Us and Payless, right? So anything can happen. So my name is Yasin Shahi, and I'm signing off. Thank you.